Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Classroom Matters podcast with me, your host, Kristy Houle, where we dive into the hottest topics in education. Today, our guest is Dr. Bibi Pirayesh. I said that right?
Got it, yes.
I practiced it a whole bunch, just so you know. And I cut it up into syllables because, I remember how to do that from school. Dr. Bibi Pirayesh, who is an educational therapist and learning rights advocate based in Los Angeles, California. She has spent the last 15 years working with schools, teachers, hundreds of children, parents to enhance the lives of children with learning disabilities. And in 2020, Dr. Pirayesh launched the Difference is Not Deficit project to help promote the importance of seeing learning disabilities as a social justice issue. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Okay, so we're going to dive right in because I found it interesting after listening to some of your other podcasts and all things that you're doing, that you sort of fell into the role of educational therapy by accident. So tell us a little bit about how that whole thing really got started for you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I sort of came to the field in a very different way, I think, than most people. I think a lot of people find their way into educational therapy from a special education or teaching background. For me, I came from a science background. I have always been interested. I mean, I come from a family of educators, and I think that has maybe helped fuel my passion around how does learning happen in the brain. So my degrees, before I got into special education, really had to do with cognitive science, neuroscience, and education, and kind of just understanding what we need to understand about the way that the brain learns and the way that children develop in order to inform our teaching. Because most teacher education is really based around curriculum. It's not really based around child development or understanding learning as a process. So that's really what my work was in, and I was primarily in the world of research, academic research around these topics. But I was feeling, the frustration that I think a lot of people in both the academic and the practical side feel, which is that, we were doing all this research, but I never really saw it make any true impact in classroom teaching or in teaching in general. And I sort of fell into educational therapy. I had never heard of it. Just because, I sort of had taken a job while I figured out my next step, which I assumed would be something like continuing my education in that field and in research. And I didn't start off as an ed therapist, obviously, but I started off working one-on-one with kids who had learning disabilities. And suddenly, taking this processing skills approach, I was able to see, in neuroscience, we say, if you want to understand a process, you need to look at it where it breaks down. And so certain learning processes were breaking down for some of these children. And I was able to see how that occurs and then how we can actually do work to rewire the brain and to create the pathways that would support them and help them. And it was sort of like this moment of, the connection between research and practice, like coming to life. And I recognize that there's an incredible privilege in, being able to do that kind of one-on-one work with the resources that you have available to you that most teachers don't in a classroom, 30 plus kids. But it was just this moment where I was like, okay, so we can bring this knowledge base into our work with children in a way that benefits them. And then I just really loved the work itself, and just that the work with kids really pulled me in. And so I really kind of went in a different direction in terms of my work, away from, I wouldn't say away from research, because I think that every educator is a researcher, every practitioner is a researcher. And I was, the research was very different now. It was sort of in the context of this work with the students. And yeah, I just, and then I sort of went into this much more practical field, which is educational therapy, and haven't really looked back. It's still the favorite part of my day is my work with students.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's how I sort of fell into it.
So what does that work look like for you, right? So you're involved in a lot of things, you're doing a lot of great things, you're working, with schools and teachers and parents around this notion of learning, how social justice issues are related to learning disabilities. So unpack that a little bit, because I know that people are listening are thinking, okay, yeah, I get the social justice thing and I get the learning disabilities thing, and now we've sort of clumped them together. So talk a little bit about
Yeah.
how you view that and some of your work around that in the schools that you're working with.
Sure. I mean, so when I first started this work, again, I was very much interested in kind of like the science of it and all of that. I wasn't really a part of the conversation around social justice. So I actually, it was again kind of what was happening in the work that shifted in some ways the trajectory of my career, because after I really started to do educational therapy, and I was, I'd been in practice for, a few years, 5-6 years, I really started to take notice of the fact that I only saw a certain kind of client. And that kind of client was usually kids who came from family. I mean, I live in West Los Angeles, so they came from families who had the resources, the wealth, the opportunity to be able to provide these services for them. And so there was kind of like that thinking of like, this, something is wrong here. I'm contributing to the divide. And as a first generation immigrant and a person of color myself, I was very aware of that. And, kind of coming into consciousness, I guess, about the fact that there's something really wrong with this private economy that we have around learning disability, where the kids who come from means get the research, get the cutting edge work, and everybody else doesn't. And my mom's a public school teacher, so there was a lot of conversations around this. So that, that was sort of one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it was that even for these kids who come from wealth and resources, the majority of whom were in, schools where their parents were paying thousands of dollars, like $50,000 a year for them to be in these schools, I was finding again and again just a complete lack of either understanding or, like an ideological refusal to address their needs. And some of it was happening in schools where they really advertise themselves as being very progressive. And, we teach all kinds of learners and this kind of thing. But then when you would get to the nitty gritty every day of it, these kids were like consistently being marginalized and giving messages of, this is the way that we do it and you don't fit and there's something wrong. So it was just very interesting to me, again, I guess, as a researcher, that, even in these spaces, ableism continues to exist. And so it was all of these sort of ongoing questions that really led me to then make a different shift. And instead of going back, which, I wanted to go back and finish my doctorate for a long time, but instead of continuing on the path of, cognitive science and kind of understanding all this stuff, I wanted to understand why is it that this research doesn't make it into practice. And so I decided to I made a conscious choice to go back and study kind of educational leadership using a social justice lens. And I think that when I started, I had a very naive and limited understanding of what social justice even is. I mean, I think I understood it intuitively because of my own positionality, but I didn't really understand it. And I had my my vision was something along the lines of, we're going to bring the principles of educational therapy to special education, and we're going to shift the systems and, blah, 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 these kind of very almost like individualistic ways that we tend to think about change. And I was very lucky because I started to work with a mentor who was also my dissertation chair, who really pushed me to re-examine my own thinking and re-examine also my own training in science, because scientific training, I think, is part of the problem. So I really began to unpack my own history and unpack my understanding of what social justice means. And then, then eventually came the realization of, it's these systems exist in the way that they do, and everything is the way that it is because that's how it's designed to be, and that's how it's meant to be. And it's not that there is this like unfortunate lack of connection between research and practice. It's that there are other kind of agendas. So, to sort of answer your larger question around social justice, I mean, I really view social justice as access to power. It really has to do with power. To what extent our systems and our ideologies kind of designed around the notion of some people will have access to power, and some people will not. And, the way that works out in terms of learning disability is that we have an education system that is very specifically designed for one kind of learner that we consider the ideal kind of learner. Anyone who doesn't fit that is essentially pathologized and pushed to the side. So, yeah, it all kind of like, it really took a deep excavation, because, again, my own training was around what is the ideal way of learning? How does the brain do it? And I couldn't quite understand that even asking those questions is ableist. And that so many of the questions that we ask in science and education are fueled by our very kind of one size fits all, or what I would call ableist, or what you might call kind of white supremacist thinking.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. No, I mean, it all makes sense though, right? Because as you're talking, I'm a former teacher and a former administrator, and I know that folks that are listening now are also teachers and parents and all, the audience, and they're thinking, wow, I never thought of a learning disability being that in that same boat as having that, as you're describing social justice, right? Having that access to power, them not having it either, but just for a different reason, and you're talking a lot about ableism. And so do you think that folks that are in the school systems, that are in the classrooms, boots on the ground, showing up, when the bell rings every day to work with these children, my first question is, do you find a lot of resistance when you bring up these topics, right? Do you find a resistance from school leaders and folks that say, oh, no, we don't support that. We don't do that. Resistance to that idea. That's my first question. Is there a lot of resistance? And then the second part of that is, do you think they even know? Are they just ignorant to these ideas, and that is happening because it's just the way it's always been?
Yeah. So I'll start with your second question.
Okay.
It informs the first one. Yes, I think that most people don't know. I certainly didn't know. And the people who know are usually the people who experience marginalization. But I think a lot of us, especially if you're a teacher, educator, therapist, people who are kind of in these healing professions, I think we sort of consider ourselves sort of heroic because we think, oh, we're helping the ones who are marginalized gain access, without the realization that that is itself quite and that in fact, when we do that, or when we lead, or when we act from that point of view, we're actually helping perpetuate the system more than we are helping the students or helping to dismantle the systems. And I think that that is something that is a very difficult realization for most people. And yeah, I mean, we have to understand that these things are we're all like fish in water. I mean, this is all baked into our system. This is what we have, what makes ableism or racism or sexism or whatever have such a stronghold is that we get these messages from the time that we're very, very young. All of us are victims of that. Ableism hurts everybody. It targets people who are differently abled, but it hurts everybody. And I think that most educators are aware of the fact that the systems aren't working. I think most of them get that and know that. But I think that we have this sort of, we've sold this naive notion to everyone of like, if we work harder, if we care more, if we do this, we are changing the systems. But that's not, I mean, that's just putting the blame on the wrong place. It's kind of like the way that we put the blame on the student with a learning disability. We do the same thing with the educators. We put the pressure on them to change things when they're really working in an impossible situation. There's no way that any single teacher is going to be able to change the oppressive systems that are ruling everyone in our school system. So I think a lot of the resistance often comes from the place where people just don't want to open that can of worms, because it essentially is going to force them to have to reevaluate everything and question everything. And they've already invested, when you've already invested, the average teacher now has a graduate degree. So when you've already invested that much into a system, it's going to feel really uncomfortable to now be like, okay, this is all, this isn't what we should have done, or this isn't working. So I understand the resistance. I understand, and we live in a capitalist society where most people are worried about their next paycheck, and they don't really have the luxury of reflecting in these ways. I mean, I think that the pandemic really helped in some way in forcing us into reflection and giving us time. And that's why I think we're sort of going through this weird stage of people not quite being able to get back to quote unquote normal, because they're like, this isn't how to be living. So I understand that. I understand the resistance. I also understand the resistance from administrators who are like, we don't want to open this can of worms. Everything is going to fall apart. So, I think that it starts with just the realization, just a realization of, I'm exhausted every day because I'm working in an impossible situation. It's not working for the kids because what we're asking them to do doesn't fit, how they actually would thrive. So just kind of realizing these things without necessarily forcing yourself to like take action or have a revolution or whatever, but just acknowledging that it feels hard, because it is hard, because it's sort of set up that way. It's set up to be hard, I think is a really good and important first step.
Well, and also, based on what you just said about, there could be individual teachers, that are saying, okay, this isn't working. But like you said, they don't want to open up that can of worms to say that. But do you also feel like not only do they not want to open up that other can of worms because they know it's too big of an issue, but also they don't know how to, they don't have another solution. Like they don't have a fix. So it's easier just to kind of continue down the same path, because I don't want to open up that can of worms, but I also don't have a better solution of how to fix the problem because it's so big. It's too big.
Yeah. So I think here's the thing. There are definitely places where you can't, like an individual person is not, despite, all of our Marvel movies and what we tried to sell, there's no individual superhero who's going to be able to do. And that's why, community is so important. But Um, I there are individual moments in which you can think differently and act differently, and in which you can exercise your power as a teacher, for example. So, for example, one of the things that I have found, and this is, how I know ableism is so deeply entrenched. So when I go to a teacher, let's say, and I ask for some kind of differentiation, accommodation, a change in, can we do this differently? Can we shift these expectations because this is what this student needs? The message that I often get back, especially in, in the public school system, I think so much is ruled by what is legally allowed and not allowed. But in a private school setting where the teachers do have, they have the freedom to be able to change things as they wish, the message that I get back is, oh no, well, that wouldn't be fair to the other students. Or, oh no, well, my curriculum is like this, like you have to meet this curriculum. If you don't, it's grade inflation, or I'm not. So it's so entrenched that even when we have the opportunity to be flexible and make changes, we don't, because we believe ideologically that that would be unjust. And we don't think about the fact that, well, is it unjust to, like, would giving glasses to someone who can't see unjust to all the kids who can see just fine? But it's so deep in there that I find that oftentimes that's what I'm fighting more than anything else. So there are places that all of us, even within these very, what I would call oppressive, sometimes even violent systems, where we can exercise, our freedom to change things, but we don't. So my recommendation would be to start there, because the more of us that begin to do that, the more of these ripple effects we'll begin to see.
And do you feel that you're seeing these issues and challenges across all demographics, socioeconomic demographics the same, or are you seeing them more prevalent in one area and less? I mean, how are you seeing this play out, these issues, depending on what area you happen to be in and what kind of school? Or do you just see it everywhere?
I honestly see it everywhere. It sometimes manifests a little bit differently. Certainly, like there are certain things, like in the public school system, the school is required by law to do certain things, but is there any actual meaningful change? Like when I sit in an IEP meeting, do I find that they're setting meaningful goals for the student? Often not. So no, I mean, I see it across the board. And I think that is the power of ideology. I mean, that's because that is kind of our thinking. Our thinking is not, and from a scientific perspective, I find this really problematic, because if science is supposed to kind of observe what exists and construct knowledge based on the reality that we see. I mean, empiricism is all about only that which you can see and measure that which you can see. But that's not what's happening. We have not built systems that are reflective of the reality that we see around us. We have built systems, and science has helped fuel this, that are just like, this is the way to be. And, we're going to create a hierarchy in terms of this is how you are. And if you don't fit this, we're going to push you to the side. And it's just, so it's bad science, really is what it is. And I just find it so ironic that everything that we do, for example, in our school system is about teaching the scientific method, and yet the system itself is basically reflecting invalid science. But we don't really talk about that.
Oh gosh. No, I mean, honestly, now that I've never really heard it put that way, but yeah, absolutely. When you kind of look at it from that lens and that perspective, I guarantee you there are teachers listening to this right now that are like, I'm gonna stand up and I'm gonna start doing things differently. And they see this on a daily basis. And it makes me think about, I had a conversation with someone yesterday about, and we really were focusing on the teacher shortage and teacher burnout, right? Because you had just said earlier about how teachers know it's a systematic issue, and there's no way that they, as one person, have the ability to stand up, even if they know it's wrong, even if they know that what they're doing on a daily basis is not what's best for the student, which then in turn, in my opinion, is leading to part of the epidemic of teacher burnout. And we're losing so many good teachers by the hundreds because of these types of issues.
Absolutely. And I mean, like I said, I think a lot of people go into professions like teaching with the best of intentions, and then they burn out because they might not name it as such, but they are functioning in an impossible scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the students feel the same way too. And I think a lot of teachers go into teaching because they want to shift things and change things because of their own experiences.
Yeah.
And then they find that it's really, I mean, that's essentially, for me, I went into kind of like, okay, I'm going to learn how to shift this at sort of like a policy or like an educational leadership or systemic level. And then there is a real shock, and then a real grief, and then a real exhaustion and burnout when you realize that you are, facing this impossible task. And so, my own response, I mean, I can share kind of my own response to that, was to say, okay, I'm not going to feel bad about this because I know that it's not me. I think a huge part of the burnout is kind of this like messaging of, oh, you're just not a good enough teacher, or you're just not whatever enough, or, really just kind of contextualizing. And once you understand that the reason that you feel, there's a valid reason why you feel this way.
Yeah.
That immediately helps to kind of take away some of that. And this is exactly what happens for the kids. So a big part of my work with kids is helping them understand that all of this negative feeling and exhaustion that they have about themselves and their brain and their learning and their everything is not because of anything that has to do with them, but because of the classroom structures and the school structures that they're expected to function in, that are not only not built for them, they're very intentionally built against them. And so of course you're going to feel like this. It's a natural, normal human response. And then, the second, and I don't want to downplay that, because it's not like that is a real grief that all of us are feeling and are navigating. The other part is to try to find the places in which you do have the freedom to act and to do differently, and then take that action, do that different. And then find community. Now, I think it's unfair sometimes with teachers, because culturally we devalue teachers and education so much. We don't pay people what they're worth. We overwork them. We don't consider them the experts that they are. So all of this eats away at you. And I think I don't blame teachers, but I do think that at least recognizing that you're not crazy, and that these are real issues that are intertwined with much larger kind of political issues is really important. This is why I think every teachers, therapists, we all have to be political activists, because you can't separate these things. And then all of this, I think, comes back to this question of, what is the purpose of education? I think one of the reasons that so many teachers feel exhausted is because they're constantly being forced to work towards a purpose of education that they probably don't believe in, which is get the kids to pass the test, get the kids to compete in the work environment. I mean, that's what our schooling has become. How do we just get these kids to be successful? Meaning, how do we get them into, working in the system? That's not the purpose of education. And it's really, really difficult, especially because teachers usually tend to be quite idealistic about the purpose of education, to do this work. So I think that in the places where you are able to exercise your freedom, and when you are able to say, in this classroom, the purpose of education is this, and so I'm going to run my classroom in that way. And of course, you're going to find resistance, and you're going to have to fight and all of that. But then at least you feel more purposeful in your work. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I want to circle back around because, you've talked about the students throughout this, and, obviously they're the most important piece. And we've also, we've talked a lot about how it's affecting teachers and the work they do, but, you've brought up students a couple of times and how they're being asked to perform in a system that just it's really built against them. And so talk a little bit about the effect that this does have on the student and how this potentially dictates a path for them from an early age in their educational journey.
Sure. I mean, and this is why I believe so firmly that learning disability is a social justice issue. So there are larger things. So for example, the school to prison pipeline, like the huge percentages of people incarcerated people who have learning disabilities, primarily, reading disabilities. Right. We know, for example, that autistic people are overrepresented in terms of unemployment. We know, for example, that Black and Brown children are hugely misdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, and then overdiagnosed. Their learning disabilities are overdiagnosed as behavioral issues, etc. So there's sort of these larger things, but I feel like social justice and this idea of access to power is something that we see in individual classrooms on a regular basis. So it's not just about these larger things; it's about those individual experiences. So I'll give you an example. For a lot of students, for example, with ADHD and executive function disorders and difficulties, it's really hard to meet deadlines. It's really hard to kind of whatever the oral directions are, however many times they were repeated in the classroom, for them to be able to retain that and plan accordingly and follow through and all of that. I mean, we know this to be true for these kids. And I have for years been advocating for teachers to, for example, not put hard deadlines on things and then penalize students, daily if they don't meet that deadline, or to have these directions that you give somewhere concrete that the student can access at any point, not just sort of like something that was given that they were supposed to write down in their agenda or whatever. Simple things that, I was advocating. And it was always a no. It was always, well, no, that wouldn't be fair to the other kids if I gave extra whatever. No, the deadlines actually help the student. Yes, they help the students, with executive function, but not if they're not able to meet it and then they get penalized. Or, well, no, I've repeated this so many times in class, they need to learn because once they get out into the, into college, they're not going to have, all of these types of, excuses that you get. And then COVID happened. And then suddenly overnight, all of these things that so many of us in the field had been advocating for and hearing a no on, suddenly overnight, it all became okay to do that for everybody. So suddenly, teachers were not having those same types of deadlines, and teachers were putting everything on, I don't know, Schoology or wherever, or repeating themselves over and over again because kids weren't necessarily in a classroom with them, etc. So it was possible, right? It's not something that they couldn't do. They could do it, but they weren't doing it because of, their belief systems or because they felt like it would create extra, whatever it was. And suddenly, I mean, obviously COVID was very hard for a lot of kids with learning disabilities, but for a lot of the kids who have executive function difficulties, suddenly being able to zoom into class and not have to navigate a whole day and go from room to room in your locker, and all of your things are just on your desk, and you can, all of it was suddenly so much easier. So this is what I mean in terms of systems that are set up. So we may set up systems believing that this is what's best for the kids, but we have to remember that we've never asked the kids, and they are, you know, their voices are not centered in the conversation of what are the standards and what works. You know, all of education has been designed, all of our curriculum has been designed by neurotypical people. All of our laws around special education have been designed by neurotypical people. This idea of, you know, access to the curriculum, all of this has been basically neurotypical. When you go into an IEP meeting, it's usually a bunch of neurotypical people sitting around making decisions for someone who isn't. So we have to recognize that. We have to recognize that that is oppressive, and to begin to make kind of like at least allow for doubt to seep into our, you know, I meet so many teachers, and I love teachers, could never do what they do. But I meet so many teachers who are just so in love with their curriculum because they've spent so much time and energy developing it. And I get that. But when that curriculum doesn't work for this student, we have to be willing to shift. So yeah, I mean, these are sort of the small ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I know, you know, that you're giving a lot of ways that teachers can sort of go up against some of these issues, but for the most important thing that I'm wanting to do with this conversation is just to even get the information out there, right? Make this an issue that is more in the forefront, and make teachers aware of this, and make school leaders aware of this, and folks, you know, on the sitting in central office aware of these issues within their schools, and that parents are aware of this, so that we can start working together, like you're saying, as a community, to start making changes, even if they're small changes, right? Like all the things you talked about with teachers in a classroom, and do this when you can control it. And, you know, it's not a one size fits all. And I love that the example that you gave about COVID is that we can do it because we just did it for 2 years. But you know, it's so funny because after COVID, it's like we just went right back to we literally just go right back into the same stuff we were doing.
Exactly. And this was one, because when COVID happened and I began to see these shifts, I was like, oh my God, a window of light has opened. Like, now we can see it. And then it all just went right back to it. And I cannot, I just, and you know, to me, this is the power of ideology. You know, I just.
And I think people wanted it to, you know, because during COVID, I was having so many conversations with educators about this, right? Like, okay, we're here. Do you think this could potentially be a catalyst to continue down this path? And they're like, oh, yes, this is and then it just didn't happen, right? And so that's kind of what you talk about when you say we're so entrenched in it. It's just like part of us that it's like we just fall back to, this is the way it's always been, even if it isn't the way that works the best for our students. We're still going to go back and do it anyway, which really makes no sense when you say it out loud.
It doesn't, but I mean that it's and you know, I want to emphasize, I mean, it's not just about this is the way that we've always done it. There are also forces that are pushing things in that direction. It's kind of like, you know, when after, you know, the lockdowns were done, they're like, okay, everyone has to actually physically come into the office now, even though all this research shows us that that's not necessarily the best way. People time in the commute, there's like so much unnecessary energy that goes into like physically being in the, you know, but we're pushing for that. I mean, and then
but now we're all back in the office.
Right. And the reasons behind that have nothing to do with what's best for the work. And everything to do with what's best for kind of corporate interests. But and it's the same in the education system. So but yeah, it's really disheartening. I mean, I have students right now where the same teachers who, a year ago were like, okay, fine, that's fine, we can do, and are now saying like, no.
Right. Just because, and because.
Yeah. I mean,
I know.
I certainly do not hear any reasonable arguments as to why.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So where can folks find you? Where can they help support what you're doing? Where can they get more information on the work that you're doing?
Sure. So my website is sort of like the hub that has the connections to everything. So that's usually a good place to start. It's oneofonekids.org. I tend to be pretty active. I sort of like engage with and let a lot of my size out about the way that things are on LinkedIn. So that's usually a good way also to connect with me. Coming back to your question about bringing awareness, the different, that's really the purpose of the Difference is Not Deficit project. I mean, it sort of grew out of the isolation of COVID, where everyone was kind of dealing with their own thing in an isolated way and nobody was talking to one another. So this idea of sharing your story, whether you're a parent, you're a student, you're a teacher, you're an administrator, sharing your story about, the conflicts and the points of tension that you have felt coming up against the system, because this is something that we all feel, but we don't necessarily talk about it.
Yeah.
That's sort of on the community page of my website. So those would be the best ways.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us on the show today. I'm going to have you come back. We're going to talk about lots of other things. We hit on a few things during this episode. We were like, that's a whole nother episode. So we're going to do that.
I would love to come back. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being a part of this. It's been a great conversation. And, I'm hopeful that folks that are listening have at least gotten a little bit of intrigue about this and want to really look more into it, right? That's the first step. So for those of you that are listening, as usual, we will have all of her information on the description page, and you can also, you can find her there and get in touch with her. But thank you. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the work that you do as well.
Okay. And this is Kristy Houle signing out for this episode of the Classroom Matters podcast.